Well, we are joined today by the Right Honorable David Lammy, who has represented Tottenham since 2000 as a member of Parliament. David Lammy, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's wonderful to be with you.
Well, you're the Shadow Secretary of State for Justice. Why has climate change become an essential part of your advocacy and work for justice?
Well, look, I suppose I'm strongly associated with issues of social justice here in the UK, and I guess issues of racial justice. And we're sort of arriving in a place, I hope globally, where we understand that climate and racial justice and social justice are inextricably linked. So what do I mean by that? I mean that here in my constituency in North London, which is Tottenham and is one of the historic homes of Britain's Black community and Britain's ethnic minority community, I see young people and adults who are really suffering under the issues of pollution that exist in our city. I see those same issues if I'm in parts of Detroit or downtown Chicago or New York. And then I visit my family or my relatives in Guyana in South America, and the country from which my parents came to this country here in the UK. And what do I see? At the moment, I see people experiencing huge and dramatic floods. I have relatives in Barbados who've just experienced a terrible hurricane in the beginning of July that's east in the Caribbean that should never normally happen. We're not even in hurricane season.
Yeah.
I suppose what I'm connecting the dots of are Black and brown people suffering as a result of what's described as the climate emergency. But for me, it's really an issue of climate justice. And so when I'm asked why you, as Shadow Justice Secretary, are interested in this, the question should be, why not? And then I see the coming issues. One of the coming issues, it's really exciting, has been our global legal experts coming together, led by Philippe Sands, and coming up with a definition of ecocide.
Yeah.
That definition of ecocide is so important for the world's indigenous people, who are the custodians of 80% of the world's rainforests and natural biodiversity. So what I'm saying is, and that is obviously a question of justice, if the world were to move in that direction. So for me, these issues are inextricably linked. And I'm surprised in a way that I still get asked that question.
Yeah. And so, we're obviously through so much of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen so many injustices unveiled as well, or we've seen how unfairly this has been, death and pain from the pandemic has been distributed. So now we have the global community coming together during COP26, post lockdown for many countries, right? And after the pandemic, there is a potential to have a greener recovery, right? And to come together and to do something about the climate crisis in a way that is more fair and just as well. As we look toward COP26, what are your hopes for COP26? How critical do you think this year will be?
Look, I mean, I want to just say, before I get to COP26, I just want to say a little bit more about what we need to be hearing, if you like, in the mood music as we run to COP26. So the first is that COP26 has got to in part be about representation. That's what I'm in the business of. That's why I'm in politics, representing people. And too often, the truth is that we ignore or we silence certain perspectives in this discussion. And I suppose I'm talking about the perspective of groups that have historically been on the receiving end of racial injustice. Groups that have been at the center of the extractive economy that we've had in our world for so many years. And I suppose I'm saying really forcefully that less than 25% of the global population is white. But we know that 80% of leadership positions in environmental organizations are white. We know that it can be deeply problematic when fighting climate change if it's framed entirely around technological solutions that allow Western democracies to preserve their way of life rather than get into the business of deep, profound change that addresses inequality and marginalized people who have been at the center of both racial injustice and that extractive economy that we invented. And so I think that I want to hear COP be about climate justice. I want to hear about COP addressing some of those profound issues that exist, particularly in the global south. I want to say categorically that in my view, the UK has a lot of ground to make up. I'm not optimistic at the way that we've led on climate justice. Frankly, during one of the worst global crises that we've had in this pandemic, it's extraordinary that the UK has decided to cut its aid budget. That is not a good run into COP26. I think that we're now in a place where our total debt sits at more than 2.1 trillion. And clearly cutting the aid budget might save 3.5 billion, but it creates profound problems in the global south. It's also the case that developed countries are committed to providing £100 billion a year by 2020, or that was the plan, that developed countries would give the global south that money. That hasn't happened. Why are we failing them? Just 78 billion has been provided, and only 1/5 of that total is made up of grants. That is a failure of leadership, and COP will need to address that. So leaders must also deliver a response to tackle loss and damage, and the unavoidable costs, frankly, of climate change on these economies. For years, this issue has been diminished by rich countries effectively exercising power over the terms of those negotiations. So COP has got a lot to do. Leadership from the UK is important. And I would say one last aspect to this is also to be a champion, not just of the technological changes, but of natural climate solutions. Remembering that the custody, particularly of our biodiversity, and important biodiversity in the world, I'm thinking very much of our rainforest, sits in the hands, for example, of indigenous people. So how do you make climate a reality for those individuals?
Well, COP26 is being held in the UK for the first time in history. What does it mean for the UK to host such a critically important event?
Look, I think this is huge. It's an important event at an important time. By the time we get to COP, Western democracies will be emerging from the pandemic. Many of them will have successfully vaccinated their populations. As we head into 2022, it's hugely important that poorer nations are able to do that. It means that some of the issues around zoonotics and our natural environment become hugely important. We have to see an end to this terrible vaccine nationalism, which is not a great indicator of how the world can come to end them. Way more generosity than we've seen hitherto to this point. I do think that I'm really excited by the change in tone and change in government that we've seen from the United States of America. I do think that we have seen in both Joe Biden's infrastructure plan, his Justice 40 initiative, we've seen the issues of equity come onto the table as you equip communities that have been left behind to be part of that clean energy investment program. I hope that European countries will learn from that initiative and follow in that way. We've not seen the same language around equity that you see, for example, in the Environmental Justice Advisory Council in European countries. There's a lot, I think, that the UK can build on that. And that also in that green jobs agenda, that you're building equity, you're building communities that have been on the front line, that have lost out previously, who can now be at the center. So I think there's an issue of money and resource, particularly to the global south, generosity in that, and understanding what many perceive as loss in their own economy. There's the natural environment, and I think that the language that we're seeing adopted in the US, I hope becomes more mainstream.
Well, how do you feel the UK has fared on climate and climate justice under the leadership of Prime Minister Boris Johnson?
Well, in the UK, we have a fantastic committee on climate change. It's an independent public body that advises us on climate targets to monitor progress. The good news is that their assessment is that we can still achieve our ambitious climate change targets and get the UK to net zero by 2050. And they have put to bed the argument that it's too expensive, estimating that the price tag of getting to net zero would be around 1% of GDP, with a potential economic boost of 2% of GDP within a decade if we do act. The bad news, though, is that the government isn't delivering on its promises. Its current policies would only cut at most a fifth of the emissions required to hit our 2035 carbon budget. And we're not adequately preparing for the impacts of climate change. Analysis released just a few weeks ago found that we're failing to protect people from the risks of both flooding and heat waves. There's a real threat, frankly, that heat wave particularly could cause 2,500 deaths in our country. We've got a real issue with our housing. We have housing that is, we're an old country with, old housing, and how you can build that into a serious green jobs agenda is still a work in progress here in the UK. So, I would say that there is a lot more for us to do, a lot more.
You're talking about housing and implementing that and the climate policy and heat. This all comes back to justice, right? In the United States, the values of the Green New Deal and the centering of racial justice in climate policies and the work by so many activists as well as policymakers to promote it, this really accelerated the awareness of these intersecting issues in the United States. I think for the general public and for a lot of policymakers in the United States, it was an incredibly positive development. How do you see awareness on the connection between racial and climate justice changing in the UK?
Look, I would say that, for example, a just Green New Deal, which is focused on investing in former industrial heartland areas putting an emphasis on the disproportionate impacts of climate change and supporting a just transition to retrain British people for a future green economy is absolutely where we need to be. It addresses profound issues here in the UK. The North-South divide in the UK is a bigger divide here between London and the industrial North than at any time, I think, since the turn of the last century. It's that big. But it's also about getting voices into the discussion from different backgrounds. And in that sense, for example, it is about leadership in the movement. Who are the leaders? How are they around the table? How are they ensuring that minorities within countries like the UK are at the table, are equipped to be at the table, and also that they're leaning in to the global south? There are a couple of things you need to do there. Where are the bursaries and the scholarships offering black and brown children here in the UK, I might say also in the United States, opportunities to take environmental sciences, to study our biodiversity? Where are those opportunities? How are they made? What is the sector doing to address those issues? Because that's where the new generation of leaders come from. How are we recognizing that this year there have been two dominant themes globally, political themes? One is the pandemic. Two is Black Lives Matter. Now, climate sits, I think, above both of those in many, many ways. In some ways, we have a pandemic as a consequence of environmental disruption and over mining, if you like, our world. What happens with our bats, and how that then, the zoonotics, and what we end up with as a consequence is as a direct result of that extraction. And the other theme has been, following the murder of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter. What I suppose I'm saying is these themes are inextricably linked to climate justice, and we need to get better at telling that story. And that does mean disrupting some of the old ways, some of the old notions of growth, the old notions of the economic model, the political economy that we have had, and issues of equity and equality, particularly for those that have been left behind.
Well, part of the reason why the story isn't being told correctly is because we're not hearing from enough voices. And you've already touched on this in our conversation. You talked about this in your Time op-ed, that these rich countries have exercised power over the terms of climate negotiations at previous COP events. And this has really hurt countries in the global south. So what are we as a global community missing when global south countries don't get their voices heard at a COP event?
Well, for me, I don't think the issue is just about a nice thing to do. We're missing 3/4 of the planet. That's the first thing. We're missing innovation and where a lot of innovation is happening. We're missing those who are the custodians, broadly, of our natural environment, and certainly of the lungs and most of the water that we consume. We're missing where a lot of the future growth and rebalancing of the world will be addressed. We're missing where most of the world's youth is found. And if there are I think there are two major engines of the world. One, of course, is what's traditionally described as white working class people in countries like Europe, big countries like Australia and the United States, But of course, it's not white working class. It's also made up of many ethnic minorities within those populations. But it's a big engine of the world. The other massive engine of the world are the poor people, black and brown people largely, of the global south. The clothes that we are wearing, the products that make our smartphones work. It's these people that work and toil on their behalf. So you cannot shut them out of a conversation about climate. You can, perhaps if it's a conversation totally about technology and the climate emergency, you can, but it's wrong-headed. The real conversation is about climate justice.
You know, I've heard you talking earlier about extraction, and I've heard you say that colonialism is the story of extraction and exploitation, and that is at the heart of the climate crisis. And recognition of those facts are key to combating the climate crisis. This is something we talk about on the show quite a bit. So how do countries like the UK, the United States, how do leaders from those countries ensure that we're actually having that recognition on the global stage?
You do need to first recognize that that is the issue. I mean, here in the UK, I think it's similar in France next door. We are not having the discussion about our history that we need to be having. Many people do not understand that history. You can come out of the best universities in the country, Oxford and Cambridge, and not fully understand Britain's colonial past, not fully understand what that extractive economy meant to those enslaved people who were worked to the bone in the Americas. Not understand why there even was a war of independence with the United States. And so the first thing is, unless you're kind of honest about that history, it's really hard to get into what that extractive economy really meant. And therefore, to be bold about what a new economy has to mean. It's very troubling here in the UK that at the same time as hosting COP26, we're starting to drill fossil fuels again in our own country. I'm afraid, or indeed that we're funding that activity or supporting that activity across the world. So you have to address those hypocrisies, and you have to be honest about that truth. And my ancestors were absolutely at the receiving end of that extractive economy. They lost their language, they lost their culture, they lost their freedom to deliver that economy. And we are the sixth richest economy in the world as a oh, forgive me, that's the bells of Parliament ringing, interrupting our conversation. So I'm sorry for listeners.
Well, this is a first.
Yes.
Tell us that we have to vote. Or actually, I think on this occasion it's telling us that, that there's a change of activity in the House of Commons chamber. So forgive me for that. But yeah, what I was saying is basically that for me is really real, that extractive economy. And there are, and the truth is, if you look at African American populations, if you look at Caribbean populations, both in this country and across the region, if you look at the continent of Africa, those straight lines of colonialism that cut off communities, tribes, that create wars, civil war, that has had huge consequences for those peoples. And you have to put those peoples at the driving center of climate justice and what we're going to do to address it.
Well, and this goes back to what you were talking about with ecocide, right? If we're truly honest about what's happening to environmental degradation across the world, well, then we have to do something about it, right? And so you were mentioning earlier sort of the legal framework for ecocide and how important that's going to be as an international community, as a policy maker. How do policymakers around the globe take action on this now?
Well, look, I think the first thing is obviously to be an ally. That's the word of the times. Be an ally, support movements, join masses, sign petitions, call out racism, be part of the conversation, engage with politics, vote for those willing to stand up genuinely for marginalized communities that want to act on climate. Have them round the table. Think about your own organization, your company, your workplace. Does it represent society? Is it reflective of its own role in society or not? You know, the ecocide movement is a good example of this. Ecocide becomes real when countries start to adopt it. They adopt it domestically. We've had some indications, for example, from President Macron that he's looking at these issues domestically within France. And of course, they come to a place where they adopt it internationally. I think it's really essential for, if you look at the plight of indigenous communities in places like Brazil, this is a no-brainer. This is really essential. And the way to look at this is to say that after the Second World War, the world came together and it created a world order. And that world order started to address some really profound things that had not been addressed before. Clearly it addressed genocide because of the horrors of Holocaust. It also addressed how we protect refugees and came up with an architecture for how we protect refugees, because never again could we see people fleeing countries and countries closing the door. It gave us the modern architecture of our human rights regime. Here we are at the beginning of the 21st century. And I'm a great believer that if the 19th century was a century that was about freedom and asserting that freedom for my ancestors, for example, to break the shackles of their chains and be free. If the 20th century has been a century of rights in which women, gay men and women, Black and brown people, those with disabilities, were beginning to throw off those shackles and assert their rights, then the 21st century, for me, is the century of repair. And repair means addressing the climate challenge. Repair, I suspect, has something to do with things like ecocide. How can you create a legal architecture similar to what we saw in that 20th century as we began to give rights to communities that have been left behind? How can you create a legal architecture that really genuinely repairs the damage that has been caused? And I think that it's getting alongside that is the challenge. And that's why I say be an ally, be engaged, ask the difficult questions, share. Do not tell me you're sitting around the table fighting for the climate emergency if everyone around that table is white and Western. We've now got Zoom and other things. Use the technology to bring other people into the conversation.
Well, I want to talk about one of the initiatives that you're working on. You co-founded the Sophia Point Rainforest Research Center, which, according to the organization, aims to transform research and conservation of Guyana's rainforests. What are you hoping to accomplish with the center?
Well, Guyana is an important country that sits on the northeast corner of South America. A lot of people don't know it exists. They think you're talking about Ghana in Africa and you're talking about Guyana. Some Americans of a certain generation know where it is because they've heard of the Jonestown massacre and Jim Jones and don't drink the Kool-Aid, right? But it's an important country sitting next to Brazil and Venezuela. It's the top of the Caribbean. It's English speaking. And the reason it's important is because it still has 80% of its rainforest intact. Most of the country, 80 or so percent, is rainforest. It's sitting there at the beginning of the Amazon basin. It's the Guyana Shield that we call it. It produces 11% of the world's fresh water. It's a country the size of the UK with a population of 700,000 people. So this is a tiny population that lives along the coast, many indigenous communities, obviously throughout most of the country in that rainforest. And we need to ensure that we don't see what's happened in Venezuela, what's happened in Brazil, happen in Guyana. And then there's another thing that's important. Guess what? The biggest oil find in a generation, offshore Guyana. So what we've seen in the Middle East is coming to this region of the world, digging at a time when we should be turning away, obviously, from fossil fuels. And the Sophia Point Conservation Center is really an effort to ensure that Guyanese young people, Guyanese Amerindian populations can really understand what is in their rainforests in partnership with the global community in terms of research and cutting edge science. It's effectively a low cost initiative, costs about $4 million with huge impact. Impact not just for the country, but for the global community. It sits on the Essequibo River, which is probably the second most important river in South America, flowing into the Amazon. So it's on and it's actually on the confluence of two other rivers just nearby. So it's in a really wonderful area. And the most important thing is it's accessible. It's relatively easy to get to. It's not as hard to get to as other areas. So it's an important country. It's and we should be there supporting local populations, working in partnership, not parachute science, not flying in, grabbing all the intellectual property, grabbing the science and flying out, working alongside indigenous populations and local people to come up with the solutions. And by the way, for example, the population of bats in Guyana is immense. This is an opportunity to really get underneath zoonotics in the pandemic. The jaguar is the national animal. It's a species under threat that we have to protect. Never mind the fauna, what's in the Essequibo River. Species have not yet been discovered. So this is an exciting, exciting project. The first book, I had a wonderful conversation with David Attenborough about the project, and he reminded me that the first book he ever wrote was following one of the first trips he made, which was to Guyana, and I think it was in 1956. He lamented that he's not been back since and he doesn't think because of his age he's going to get back, but he absolutely understood the importance of the country and the benefits of the Sophia Point Rainforest Research Center that we're trying to set up.
Well, you mentioned the discovery of the oil in Guyana, but it's not fair to ask developing countries not to extract or burn fossil fuels when countries like the UK and the US have reaped, immense economic benefits from a fossil fuel economy over the last 150 years. So how do high wealth countries both support sustainable development while also just getting out of the way and avoiding that colonialist mindset and telling developing countries how they should generate their own economic growth?
Absolutely. I think that's very important. And I certainly am not keen to lecture friends and colleagues in politics in Guyana about what they should or shouldn't do. What I can tell you is the UK certainly can't start lecturing if it itself is deciding to mine fossil fuels within its own country. I think this is a big dilemma for countries as poor as Ghana. Ghana, not so long ago, was the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere after Haiti. So what are the incentives? How do you stack them up to really equip a country like Ghana to make choices that are of benefit the entire global community? And how do you ensure that if you are going to get development through fossil fuels, that it is not at the jeopardy of 80% virgin rainforest that exists in that country. I think that's my focus at the moment. It is how to ensure we do not get detrimental logging, disruption and development that has huge consequences, not just for that country, but for the global community. But clearly some of the issues that arise at COP, some of these issues about equity and climate justice have got to be at the heart of how you have that sort of discussions on fossil fuels. Or it is just countries that did it lecturing countries that are not as economically advanced not to do it. I mean, that ain't gonna work.
Yeah, I'd like to get your thoughts on climate reparations. I mean, do you believe countries like the UK and the US should be financially responsible for the climate adaptation and loss and damage costs incurred by countries that have not contributed nearly as much to the global climate crisis?
It seems clear to me that the world is interdependent. We're living through this year at a time where we understand we do not get out of the pandemic, the lockdowns, the pressure it's placed on our economies until folk in Africa and a lot of poor parts of the world are also vaccinated, and they cannot do that on their own. And by the way, why is it that the development of generic drugs and other things are largely confined to those Western democracies? Why have we not seen those innovations in those countries? It's brutally unfair. Why are we not relaxing intellectual property rules to allow other countries to move forward on the vaccines in the way that we should? This conversation is inextricably linked to debt, and the debt that saddles many of those economies, which should not be the case. Much of that debt should have been written off years ago. It's a conversation linked, of course, to aid. And as I've said, cutting your aid budget, as we've seen here in the UK, is precisely the wrong way to go, particularly at this time. And so it seems to me that the conversations about, you can describe it as you want to describe it. Reparations is one way to describe it. But surely this argument was run years ago. It is absolutely clear that there has to be some transference of wealth from richer economies to poorer economies. Understanding, by the way, that's not just about noblesse oblige, that's not just about generosity, it's about understanding how that wealth was built and by whom it was built, particularly here in Europe, the United States, Canada, and countries like Australia.
This podcast series is the road to COP26, but we want to, when we look back on COP26, what would you see as success? What were you looking for as success from COP26 around climate justice and even climate reparations?
I think that I would love to see, in a year in which there was so much pain and so much death and so much fear as a result of the global pandemic, that the world recognized its independency, recognized why we had that pandemic, and acted on the issue of our times, which is the climate emergency. And that COP saw that through the lens of climate justice and equity. That in a year in which we faltered, particularly on the vaccine rollout and on the vaccine nationalism, by the end of that year, 2021, the world moved in a very different direction. And the resources, the consciousness of nature, the natural environment, the importance of things like rewilding was center stage, as well as some of the technological discussions that, of course, are going to get us down the line. That, I think, will be a successful COP. That needs a shifting. And it definitely needs big powers around the table alongside Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to look at what's happened in the United States, how quickly you could pivot from Trump to Biden within a month to get something else. If the global community can make that kind of shift as well, then this is going to be a very, very exciting end of year.
But as you talked about, we've seen nationalism, as you talked about, is not going away. And I know in your book, Tribes, you write about that very human pull that we have to wanting to be a part of a group, but also the downsides that we see when we project that group identity. And certainly that has been the case in the way we've seen nationalism with former President Trump, and obviously the rhetoric around Brexit as well. How do you think nationalism could potentially negatively influence something like international agreements on reducing emissions?
Well, look, thank you for mentioning my book, Tribes. That's very kind of you. And I did explore in that this new tribalism that we're seeing, that in a sense, tribes can be good. That sense of belonging that we can feel to our neighborhood, our community, that patriotism we can feel to the country that we're part of. We all have to share the space that we live in with others. And right from the beginning of man, you start in a small, almost familial unit as a tribe. You cross the valley, over the hill, and you meet somebody else. And mankind at a certain point worked out that actually, let's work together. We can get more food, we can make more fire, we can produce more goods, and working together. And you're right to indicate that at the moment there is a tendency in parts of the world, we've seen it in the United States, we've definitely seen it in our country, to deliberately stoke culture wars, to deliberately stoke populism, to deliberately play to hate, and I'm afraid to undermine democracy, because no democracy functions if you belittle or demonize your minority. A civilized country is a country that lifts up minorities. It doesn't demonize minorities. And we saw that during the Second World War, and what we were fighting against in the form of Hitler. And the populism is deeply, deeply worrying, because empirically it leads to a very, very dangerous place. So in a sense, COP is the best of those traditions of coming together to deal with our international challenges. The question is, how serious are we prepared to be about those international challenges? And to what extent we want to learn the lessons of history and where those international challenges come from and why they exist. And so you do have to beat back tribal and nationalistic tendencies that mitigate against that. It's why Trump didn't want to have anything to do with it, wasn't interested. It did not play, it was not part of his playbook. What's good though, is that we are seeing in this pandemic, those countries that were most nationalistic are learning the lessons of where that has led in terms of death toll and other things. And so I do still want to be hopeful that COP coming at the end of this year is an opportunity to mark a different course and a different global order.
Well, let's just wrap up here with a non-climate or COP26 related question. I know, you've obviously been a member of parliament, as we mentioned, for more than 20 years. I'm just curious, what are some of the biggest ways you think your approach to politics has changed over the last 20 years?
Oh, when I came into politics, it was a time when people talked about voter apathy. Yeah. This was the era of Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, and it was a consensus period. It was, to some extent, the neoliberal order was intact. There was a complacency. I don't think anyone talks about apathy anymore. I think that we see in the millennials and younger a real appetite for social action. These are the children and grandchildren of baby boomers, a big generation. a generation who are not inheriting what their parents did, economically, structure of their countries, the jobs that are available, and of course, the planet has been heated up with all the consequences that that has. So I think that this is a very different political moment to the moment when I entered politics 21 years ago. I'm a Gen Xer, mini generation, and pivoted by these two big ones. So I think this is a different moment, different things are required. In a way, it's bolder, it's more radical. And unless we take those bolder, radical steps, you're just going to get left behind. It's a transitional moment, though. What I would say about, Generation Z and Y and younger generations is that they haven't yet got their hands on the levers of power. They're not running FTSE 100 companies. They're not really running countries. So it's a transitional period, this decade. And what we need to see is the kind of leadership that steps up to what the future demands. I've been generous about what I'm seeing from the United States and its current leadership. I want that to infect the whole global community. And countries need to look beyond their narrow individual self-interest, no more of the sort of nationalism that we've seen during the pandemic and that we saw terribly in periods before it, Donald Trump being at the apex of that, Bolsonaro, but to some extent, Boris Johnson as well.
Very well put. Well, the Right Honorable David Lammy, we will link to your book, Tribes, as well as the Sophia Point Rainforest Research Center in our show notes so people can learn more. And thank you again for joining the Climate Pod.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. I had a headache at the start of this, and my headache is alleviated. Clearly, it was all about passion and talking. Thank you.